Welcome to From the Resort podcast. Today is the 11th of December 2020. This is episode number 8 in this particular series. Again, we have another member of the Queenstown Rotary Club. Here we have Jim Huitt, who is now retired, has moved to Queenstown more recently. He has a business background, managing companies in crisis and turning those companies around, and obviously those companies will either thrive or be sold on to somebody else. Welcome along to the podcast, Jim.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you very much for taking part. And I just thought you might have a bit of an interesting story to be able to tell our listeners, a bit of a different perspective, and be able to bring some insight with some stories that you may have back in the States. Tell us about whereabouts were you born and where did you grow up early in life?
Right. Well, I was born in Norman, Oklahoma. Sounds like an unlikely place. But my father, this is after World War II, was doing a PhD in petroleum engineering at the University of Oklahoma, and there were two big oil and gas, science universities, Oklahoma and Texas, and actually Colorado School of Mines, I would say, is a third. And anyway, that's where I was born. After that, we moved to Dallas briefly, and then to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where my dad was led a research team at Gulf Research and Development in Harmarville. Gulf, for those who don't know, is one of what they call the Seven Sisters, the big major international oil companies with BP and Chevron and Exxon and Shell and so forth. And then I moved to London when I was 16 years old. My dad went to work there and led the U.S. side of Huitt Oil Company. It was half owned by Gulf and half owned by BP. And it's been a very interesting summer in Kuwait, and ended up with a few very close Palestinian friends. A lot of Palestinians had fled Palestine. We entered there right after the 6-Day War, which is a chaotic time in the Middle East. And I can remember my father sending agents into the war zone to try to find relatives of Palestinians that worked for him. They were engineers and the dentists in the company, and accountants, all sorts of professionals. It was a different time. It was a very westernized kind of place. I mean, you had your nomads, but all the people that were in the cities looked and dressed just like we did, and drove cars and so forth. Anyway, I left home and I graduated from high school.
Before we sort of get too far down the track, I mean, can you remember what sort of hobbies and sports that you sort of enjoyed as a youngster growing up?
Well, I played drums, and there's a thing in the United States and high schools and colleges called marching bands, which are a lot of fun if you've never seen one. They usually perform at the halftime of big football games, but anymore the talking heads take over and you don't get to see them much. But that was something I did. Was a lot of fun. I played football early in high school. That was really about it. I've always enjoyed a lot of reading, study, and history, and London was a great place for that. I would get up Saturday morning, walk all day long all over London, just wherever I went. There's always new things to see.
So you sort of, as far as London, you used to obviously walk around and see the sights, take it all in. So with London, what was the first job that you would have had as a child or as a 16-year-old when you were in London?
Well, I couldn't get a visa to work there, so I didn't. I was expected to study. The first job I ever had was when I was in college, and I delivered pizzas.
Okay.
And for a very, very clever man who had a pizza shop, and of course in those days there was no internet, but he had a Rolodex, and he would write down people's names and everything he could remember from them. And I would watch him. Somebody would call in and he'd say, "Who is this?" And he'd be flying through his Rolodex, and he'd say, "Oh, how's your girlfriend Mary? Your mom and dad still living?" And everybody thought this guy was their best friend. The other trick he taught me is he'd give me 4 or 5 pizzas during finals, and I'd just go in the dorm and call out a name, and if nobody came, I'd say, "Anybody want to buy a pizza?" Sell them all. The really clever businessman. Those are the people that are down, on the ground doing business. It's not terribly theoretical, but it's amazing how smart they can be. And this guy was Jewish, and his girlfriend was a short Mexican woman with a limp. They were quite a couple. After I then left the University of Oklahoma, where I was there, and went to Ohio State, where the woman I'm married to today was studying physical therapy. And that was
the lovely Cora.
Yeah, my wife Cora. And one of us needed to move if we were going to be together, and the physical therapy school was in the School of Medicine. And at the University of Oklahoma, that wasn't in Norman where the main campus is, about 35, 40 miles away in Oklahoma City. But at Ohio State, the hospital was adjacent to the campus. So that's the only reason I went there. I had a wonderful experience there, got a great education. I was in an honors program, and economics was my major. When I got out of college, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. So I went to law school. And went to law school at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. It's one of the top 10 law schools in the United States. So I was very, very fortunate to get in there. 10 years ago, I would never gotten in. It was so competitive. But now, after the '08 recession and now COVID, I could probably get in once again. But while I was there, I also did an MBA. So I had pretty much the aura of a professional student. So when I finally stopped studying, I had 3 degrees, and I left and went into the practice of law. I was practicing tax law, which was I was getting bored with it, but also I was writing tax opinions for things in the United States called tax shelters, which were ways to legally avoid paying income taxes, or I should say more like postponing it, sometimes as much as 10 years. But those all went away after Ronald Reagan's Tax Reform Act of '86. But anyway, that was well after I left. And I met people in the oil and gas business. And, it's kind of like the high-tech businesses today. People were getting into it everywhere. Everybody was trying to, swinging hard, trying to hit the ball over the fence, as we say in baseball. So it was real easy. And people were making a lot of money, and some people were going broke. So I left and went into that business. And not long after I went into that business, I borrowed $100,000, which would probably be more equivalent to $500,000 US today. I mean, with inflation from 1982. Invested in the company, and we were doing great. We had offices in Richmond, Virginia, where I was, Denver, Colorado, and Houston, Texas. And the price of oil in 1982 broke, and it fell from about $40 a barrel all the way down to $11. And many of the things we were doing were that was below the marginal cost. So we were losing money with every barrel of oil we pumped. And scrambled around. I got out of that business. We moved it to Denver. Got some infusion from some people who insisted on taking control, as you would imagine. So I was out with nothing to show for it, $100,000 in debt. So it's probably the lowest point in my life. But I had worked through the troubles in that company, and it struck me, maybe there's a business or a profession here. And one of the directors of the company knew a Swiss bank that was looking for somebody to run an oil company in Richmond, Virginia, that was mostly operated in the Appalachian Basin of West Virginia and Western Virginia. And it was in trouble. And that was the first real workout turnaround crisis management gig that I had. There's a real interesting story behind that for somebody, 30, I guess I was 32, 33 at the time. I'll take a little time telling you this because I think it's a fascinating story. The Swiss bank was Saracen Bank out of Basel, Switzerland, and it was what's called a family-owned bank. But, the partners had unlimited liability. They owned the bank. They were all family members by birth or by marriage, and every one of them was enormously wealthy. There's probably maybe a dozen of them. And the old man who was at the top of the heap was a guy named Alfred Saracen. And they had hired a German guy named Hans Riepel to run their bond operation, which they located in London to avoid Swiss taxes, but also that's where the action was. So I took over this company. I was assigned to report to Hans Riepel in Germany. And the company had been put together by a guy named Zilke, and he had disappeared. And it was pretty clear that the things he had told the investors were false. And so Hans and I hired a private investigator that ran this guy down. And here's how he got into the Swiss bank. There was a smaller bank run by a guy who was a sweet man with a great intellect, but he never should have been in business, and he inherited a bank in, I can't remember where it was. I think it was Zurich. And this guy, Zilke, professional criminal, targeted him and said, "You may not remember this, but right after World War II, when your father was on loan from the Austrian government to the United States to work on the Marshall Plan, we used to play together in the Wilshire Hotel in the hallways." The guy couldn't quite remember that, but he had so many details and facts. He said, "I met you then." And he said, "But we've come a long way. The Zilkas, we're Polish, and we know the Pope, John Paul." And, through the church, we've managed to be steered to some very, very lucrative mining operations and concessions, and we're real rich, and I've got these companies. Wouldn't you like to invest in them? So he took the guy. And the guy, Swiss banks, will invest their customers' money. And so a lot of client money was invested in 3 companies: a mining company in California that later I moved to Reno, a liquor importing business, and then this last one, Merrill Natural Resources. Well, it turned out Zilka had been living with his parents, and he'd been a real estate agent until the day he decided to pull his sting and convinced this guy to invest all this money in these businesses, which he hadn't a clue how to run. So they crashed and burned. So Hans Riepel and I wanted the banks to go after this guy and not only sue him, but get the authorities involved and perhaps file criminal charges against him. And after some consideration, the people in Basel came back and said, "We don't want to do that because we don't want it in the papers that a bank that we bought and now own invested client money in this bunch of garbage.
Yeah.
That would really stain our reputation." Well, they were so concerned about being in the paper, and then the strangest thing happened. In the United States, it's against the law to trade securities on what's called inside information.
Insider trading, yeah.
Yep. Well, there was a company called Santa Fe Drilling, and it was about to, I think, announce major oil and gas find or something. It was going to be really big. And starting 2 days before that announcement, people were trading options to purchase the stock like mad. And it was just a huge red flag, and the Security Exchange Commission said, whoever's doing that had inside information. Well, they tracked a bunch of the trades back to Panama City, Panama, and from there they tracked them back to Saracen Bank, of all things.
Yeah.
And a number of the family members, including Alfred Saracen's girlfriend, had profited from this. So they ended up in the front page of the Wall Street Journal with this article about what had happened. And it has kind of an interesting end. They were afraid to come to the United States to meet with me and talk about the businesses. They were afraid that they'd be locked up and told, you're not leaving the country until you sit down and we take your deposition under oath as to what happened and who's involved. But Alfred Saracen was a very wealthy, powerful man in Swiss banking and in the international banking. And he knew Paul Volcker, who was chairman of the board of the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States. And this was a time of great turmoil. Volcker's the guy who drove interest rates in the United States up to 13-14% to get inflation out. Well, the charges were dropped against the Swiss, and I was later told that the reason that happened is that Alfred Saracen promised Volcker that he would work in Switzerland to make changes to the secrecy laws that had baffled American, law enforcement for many years. The money got to Switzerland. They clammed up and didn't know anything. So, and after that, I got into the business, and I told somebody I was going to write a book, and I was going to title it "This Shit Really Happened." And the guy said, "You're young. You don't understand. This shit always happens."
Yeah.
And that turned out to be true. I had, every engagement I had, there were twists and turns. When people are in financial trouble, they do crazy things. They're not honest. It's a very, very interesting career.
So did you end up writing a book then about this?
Never did. There were 3 times I ran publicly traded corporations or listed companies, I think you call them here.
Yep.
That I was brought in by a board that was basically being told by their banks, you got to get rid of the person in charge, but they didn't want to take who the bank offered. And in 2 of those, I ended up having to take somebody, out of the business. I walk in with security and tell them you're leaving right now. Some really devious things that I ran across. Pretty tense days. And at one point, I was a trustee in a conclusion of a bankruptcy. And at one point I controlled, under this trust, for the benefit of the creditors, 2 18-hole golf courses, a 9-hole golf course, an airport, a convention center, and about 800 commercial lots on Lake Travis in Texas. And they were taken into the trust from a Japanese company that owed us a whole lot of money, and we eventually had to, in the early one morning, go take out their manager with the sheriff with us and take over those pieces of property. There's some tense times. One of my more interesting times was I did a workout and turnaround for Liberty University, and for people that in the United States would probably recognize that name, it was the premier ministry of Jerry Falwell, well-known American evangelist. Really an interesting guy, and he managed to get himself deep into debt as well. But anyway, those are a few of the engagements that I did. And I've got more stories, but we probably want to move on to something else so we don't run out of time.
I could certainly listen to your stories for hours on end. I reckon it was something. Obviously, it's a big global world out there, and a lot of different things happen, and people come from lots of different backgrounds, and yourself, your experiences be completely different to anyone else that I've ever met. So it adds to quite a good listen, and quite a good. You always find out some interesting things. So that's some of I guess what you sort of got in as far as your career and being and then I guess you want to sort of reflect on your career and basically managing companies in crisis, go through tough situations, getting solutions in place. As far as that as a career, I mean, obviously you did lots of other things. I'm sure you did lots of other jobs as well, and delved into that. But is that something that obviously stands out from everything else that you may have done?
Oh yeah, I mean, I did that for 32 years. It was tough on my family for many years because I would be gone from Monday morning till Thursday night or Friday. And when I was working for a company called Buccino and Associates, the largest crisis management company in the United States, I was all over the country. But I couldn't take that forever, and I ended up with a group of friends that are out of Baltimore, Maryland. We had offices in Richmond, Baltimore, a place in Maine. Where else were we? Atlanta. And then I was able to stay much closer to home, and had that career. It was always an exciting profession. I never had a boring day at work. And
so I guess of the time that you sort of spent, how many years would you have lived in, where you originally came from, Oklahoma, when you go back?
When my father finished his PhD, we left Oklahoma for Dallas. Yeah. And we lived there a few years, and then went to Pittsburgh, where I basically grew up.
Back there, did you? You came back there after London, or?
Well, I went back to the University of Oklahoma, where my father was, and I went to school there for 2 years. And then I went to Ohio State in Ohio, where Cora was. Yeah, yeah. My parents ended up back in Texas, and I've spent a lot of time there with them. My brother's still there, but it's a place that I'm fond of.
Brothers and sisters? How many brothers and sisters?
I got one brother who was career Coast Guard, taught electronics, and then when he got out of the Coast Guard, he bought some land next to my parents had about 350, 400 acres. After my dad retired, when Gulf was bought by Chevron, and he was raising purebred Limousin cattle. Limousin is a French breed, well known for putting on weight in the pasture, as opposed to being sent to like a feed yard where they just cram them with corn, and also birthing easily. So he went there, and he's been a rancher there for quite a while. He's 67 now, and his herd's down to probably 20 cows, and he's ready to get out of it. But
so you say your brother lives in Texas. Did you say he lives in Texas?
Let me turn this on. Yeah, my brother does live in Texas, and we usually fly to New Zealand through Houston and get to see him once or twice a year, at least.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. As far as all the different places in America, what are the fondest places to spend time and to live?
Dang it! I thought I turned this off.
It's okay.
Yes. Oh, fun this place. Well, I loved living in Virginia. Richmond, Virginia it was a wonderful place to live and raise children. It was a city that had lots and lots of culture, but it wasn't. It didn't have the traffic issues you'd have in Atlanta or Houston or, New York, someplace like that. Very, very pleasant place to live. And now we have a home on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, which is on the Atlantic Ocean, and that's just great. We've got a home on Currituck Sound, so we're looking across the sound between the mainland and the barrier islands, which are on the ocean there.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a very pleasant place. Though, we've had a couple of storms, hurricanes that have caused some damage, to be honest with you. But we've been going down there for 25 years, and there have been two storms that frightened us quite a bit. One did some damage, probably about $40,000 worth of damage, mostly to docks and bulkheads in our yard. But, out of 20-some years, that ain't bad. The insurance is expensive, but it's a great place to live and retire. And we spend about half the year there now and half here in Queenstown.
Mm. So obviously, we'll talk about Queenstown, but I guess as far as Rotary is concerned, obviously that's how we met. We met
right.
In the Rotary Club here in Queenstown. Both of us, we haven't been here very long when it comes to the Queenstown Rotary Club. Obviously, it's a fantastic club. We've had a couple of president and president-to-be on the podcast already. So tell us about, I guess, your first involvement in Rotary. I think you said Cora probably first got in Rotary before you did. And so how did this all happen?
She joined a Rotary Club in Richmond, Virginia called the Bon Air Rotary Club, and she had her office like 2/10 of a mile from where they would meet. So she joined and got very active in that club. And I had other things I was interested in, in doing, and she kept wanting me to join. And in the United States, at least in our district, people go through the ranks. They start as secretary, and then they go to treasurer, and then they go to vice president, and then to president.
Yep.
She was treasurer.
Yep.
She was struggling with that. And then, interestingly enough, we were talking about accounting systems, that they had QuickBooks, and they had made a mess of it. So I took over that, even though I wasn't a member. But as soon as she became, she was president-elect, I joined. And I've been a Rotarian now for probably 10, 11 years.
Yeah.
And it was a great club. And my wife being so active in it, we would go to district conferences, which were always a blast. And we've been to international conferences in Copenhagen, Atlanta,
place.
and Los Angeles, and all three of those were wonderful events with great speakers. I mean, 20,000 people in a hall is pretty incredible.
That is incredible.
Yeah,
it's like watching a basketball game, isn't it?
Yeah, it's on huge jumbotron. The people speaking. If you don't get there early, you're halfway back there. You're going to watch the screen the whole time rather than the people on the stage. I've had great experiences with Rotary. Great service. It's it's an organization with some real values. And interestingly enough, you say I'm a member of the Queenstown Rotary Club. We've paid full dues and we participate as much as we can, but International Rotary will not let us be members of two clubs at the same time.
Yep.
So when we arrived, we were already members of the club in the Outer Banks of North Carolina, the First Flight Rotary Club in Kitty Hawk. And so we couldn't officially join. We're trying to decide now which one we will put our loyalty to and maybe become a full-time member, regular member in Queenstown, and sort of a visiting member in the Outer Banks like we're doing here. But it's a great club here. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, I've been impressed with this club. Well, even well before we joined, we sort of came along to, and you may have done the same thing. When you came here on a holiday in the past, we sort of stepped in and gone into a Rotary meeting, Rotary changeover that I had here a couple of years ago, and that's how you get to you get a good feel, and this is for us sort of thing. It's really, really nice. But I think my understanding, Jim, is that you and Cora have obviously got other family that live here in the area as well, and. Tell us about, I guess, everybody sort of coming across from the States to here. When did that all start? When was the first time one of your family made the big move?
Well, my middle child, Abigail, was backpacking around Australia and New Zealand And I don't know if it still exists, but at that time there was a bus with a little trailer behind it. And you'd load your bicycles and backpacks in there. And it made a circle around the South Island. You'd get on and get off. You paid a fee whenever you wanted to. She was the last person on the bus one night and got to talking to the driver. And she said, I've never wakeboarded. I'd really like to give that a try. Is there anywhere around here? And he said, well, I got a mate up in Kaikoura where we're going to next. And he said, well, let's go see. So he just pulled his bus up there, and they spent the night. And my daughter met Fraser McKenzie. And 2 weeks later, the bus had gone on, but she was still there. And they developed quite a relationship. But they went separate ways. She came back to the United States to go to law school, and Fraser worked. I guess he'd been back from Australia by then. He worked in London and Scotland. And after her second year in law school, they got married. And you want to pause that for 1 second? Yeah. Cora.
So we're back.
Yeah. So Abigail and Fraser got married her last year in law school, and they lived in Charlottesville, Virginia, where the school is. And Fraser worked there as a carpenter. He's a very, very skilled chippy, I guess they call him over here. And after law school, they came back here, and Fraser had a business doing remodeling and additions onto homes. And Abby practiced law, first at Mac Todd, and then later at Berry & Co. She practiced.
I've heard of Mac Todd here in town, yeah.
And so she was practicing both real estate and immigration law. And after the Christchurch earthquake,
Going back,
yep, there's a interesting way people organize home building in New Zealand and in Australia with franchises, and David Reed is one of those, which gives them national buying contracts and a guarantee that if any franchisee goes broke, the franchisor will complete the house, and some other things that really make sense. Well, the guy in Queenstown went up to Christchurch thinking he would get tons of business after the earthquake.
Yeah.
And he wasn't doing anything here, and the franchisor told him he needed to either return to Queenstown and get after it, or he needed to give up the franchise. So I came over, and we negotiated a purchase of that business. And then from there, we went through, of course, really hard times in 08, 09. But since then, it's been... So that's pretty much the story of my older daughter. She's been married for 14 years. She has 2 children. Hatton, who we call Hattie, and Hollyford, who we call Holly, and they're 6 and 8 and 6. So they're one of the main reasons we're here is to be with them. My younger daughter got a finance degree and a master's of accounting degree at Tulane University in Louisiana. Went to work for Deloitte, which is one of the big 3 or 4 accounting firms, worldwide firms, in Washington, D.C., where she was on the audit of Freddie Mac, which Fannie Mae, which is a big national mortgage company that's chartered by the United States government with a balance sheet, believe it or not, bigger than the U.S. Federal Reserve. And some others, so she never had a downtime. She was just working, 60, 70 hours a week and getting burned out. And her older sister did some business with a Deloitte partner. I think he's from down in Dunedin. And asked him, what about my little sister? And he said, well, she's been trained by Deloitte in the U.S. I'll put her to work tomorrow. So she resigned from Deloitte U.S. and came over here and went to work for Deloitte. She had a 6-month contract. After 2 months, they gave her a full-time employment, and she was the only auditor in Queenstown, which is kind of interesting. Deloitte audits all the schools, the airport, Millbrook, and some others, and she was, this young, very young accountant, basically the lead on all of those audits. It was challenging in a different way. She had a lot of balls in the air, but she didn't have, the long hours. She just recently started to work at the Queenstown Airport, where she's an analyst, a business analyst for landing fees, cargo fees, all the private vendors, the rental car companies that pay to the airport, and cafes and so forth. So she just started that job. She's real happy with it. So that's how I came to be in Queenstown. She's got a man in her life that I don't know if they're calling each other partners yet or not, but they're pretty. They seem quite comfortable. So I think I'm going to have 2 daughters here forever.
Yep.
And as long as we can, we'll go back and forth between the United States and in Queenstown.
Yeah, so I guess it's a good synopsis of the connection that you have with Queenstown. If you sort of reflect on where it is and how beautiful of a place it is, what activities you like doing for recreation here, tell us about what you enjoy about Queenstown, some of the things that really appeal to you.
Well, it's probably the most beautiful place in the world. I mean, I've been in many, many places in the world, and this is truly, beautiful and livable. I mean, there are places that are more stunning, but, you're out in the wilderness or, some place where it's, in the winter it's -10 or something. But anyway, this is gorgeous. We love to travel around New Zealand. We love the wineries. There's a lot of great restaurants. I didn't take up golf till I retired 5 years ago, but I love to play golf. My son-in-law is a keen gunsman. He's very, very good with a shotgun, sporting clays. He's taken up long-range shooting. So I spend time with him doing those things.
Yeah.
I have yet, believe it or not, I've yet to snow ski here, but I brought my ski clothes this time. They're here for next winter. But we love to ski. We do that a lot in the United States. I love to scuba dive, but the water here is too bloody cold for me. I like warmer water, but I sure enjoy the craze that Fraser pulls up out of the cold water pretty regularly. So that's another thing we share as a family. If we can get to some place like Vanuatu, we're all under there together.
Yeah.
But otherwise, I'm on top in the boat waiting for them to come up.
So whereabouts if you were back in the States, whereabouts would be the ideal place to ski?
Well, there's so many good places. Colorado's got a bunch of world-known resorts, and I've skied out there in just about all of them. One of my favorite is Breckenridge, very, very family-friendly place. But also when you get over into the Sierra Nevada mountains, around Reno in California, Squaw Valley, where the Winter Olympics were one time. Heavenly, there's just a bunch of resorts there. But on the East Coast, about the closest places we go to is a place called Snowshoe in West Virginia. And it has a relatively short season. They'll be lucky to get open by Christmas. They usually do barely, and early March they're pretty much done. But it's a short drive. It's about a 3.5, 4 hour drive, and really a lovely place. So that's where we ski on the East Coast.
If you sort of look at those particular, is it like the air's like fresh in those sort of resorts and ski areas that you go to in America, like in Queenstown, or is it a different sort of feel the air when you're sort of breathing in the air?
I think Queenstown is probably pretty similar to Snowshoe, in that it doesn't have all that long of a season, and the runs are about the same in length. The resorts in Colorado and California, I mean, you'll be on a chairlift or a gondola or a cable car for 15 minutes, and you're halfway up the mountain, and then you'll go on up on a chairlift, and you may not come all the way to the bottom of the mountain until the end of the day. And there's restaurants and things on the top and in the middle, so those resorts allow you to really spread out and have nice long runs. And there's all sorts of different skill qualities. I used to ski. Sometimes I would ski a black diamond, which is like our second to hardest, but now I'm pretty much blue and green.
Yeah, fair enough. So I guess Queenstown. We've spoken a bit about how lovely this is, and obviously, you probably can see yourself here majority for the rest of your life. Do you think?
Anywhere from 4 to 6 months, depending. A year. I mean, some years we'll be here 8 months and back in the States 4, and then vice versa.
Yeah,
it kind of depends, but I mean, we're 70 years old. We'll reach a point where that travel's a long haul.
Yeah, it is a long haul.
And at that point, if we can't travel, we'll have to decide where we want to be, either in New Zealand or the States, and that'll be it. But, hopefully that's 10 years away, and in the interim, we're going to have a best time we can with our grandchildren and our children and enjoy them.
Yes. So, what do you think about, I guess, the way the countries that New Zealand, how that sort of works? It's obviously a lot different to America.
Right.
A lot different political systems in Australia, New Zealand versus America. We've recently just had the election over in the States, and that's been a fairly crazy ride, hasn't it, for everybody in America?
It has. It's a mess, and I have a hard time talking about politics with people in New Zealand, and this has just gotten worse over the years because your news is coming from your national TV1 and from the BBC, and that is one side of a story, and neither of them will carry stories that are show Donald Trump in a good light, and they will kill stories that show Joe Biden or the Democrats in a bad light.
Yeah.
So you get a really superficial and very biased look at it. Now, I've met people that read deeply, and they know, what's going on and a lot more. And I'll just give you an example. I think it was yesterday, the day before, TV1 saying Donald Trump suffers major blow before the Supreme Court of the United States. What happened was the one Justice Alito in charge of the circuit, which this case is coming up from, refused or denied what's called a preliminary injunction. They asked that he order the states to stop certifying elections until the hearing. Well, that's one judge, and because he's in charge, it's basically a unanimous opinion. So it didn't do anything to the case. The case hasn't been decided, but it was put forward as some major defeat. And that's the kind of skewing and nonsense that unfortunately has left impossible to talk with people about some of it. But I don't know. I mean, do you want my thoughts on what's happened and where we're going?
I guess my thoughts, because obviously when we back in New Zealand, if we're trying to look at what's happening, we're certainly very confused as to what's actually happened in this election.
Yeah.
It's a different election to any other that we've ever seen. We're seeing a president where we had some crazy swings as far as whether he was going to get in or not. The voting, the odds were all over the place. The voting, the way they counted it, and the way it's coming across, it's hard to fathom what sort of happened, and we've got sort of a crazy reaction from him in these Twitter posts and all this sort of. It's just
people that want to they go off on Donald Trump, and I say, what you need to do is stop reading his tweets or listening to him, because it's just going to drive you crazy and upset you, and that's him being Donald Trump, but that's not what his administration is doing. And what happened in this election, I think we can lay partly at the door of COVID. Because of COVID, a number of states, governors, and in a couple of cases, courts ordering the states to basically ignore their election laws. And if you do an absentee ballot in the United States, you have to apply for it on an application you sign. They send you the ballot, you stick it inside another envelope you sign, and they compare those signatures and the signature on your driver's license to make sure you are who you are, and then the ballot's taken out of that envelope, which is now anonymous, and dropped in the pile. Well, they decided that because of COVID, people couldn't come to the polls, so they mailed ballots to every single name on their registers. And we know for a fact, many of these places, they haven't purged their rolls in 25, 30 years or more. So there's literally thousands of dead people on those rolls. There are literally tens of thousands of people that have moved away and aren't there. So the ballots arrive at apartment buildings or wherever they are.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
Yeah. So it's turned into a real chaos, because it's clear that many of these ballots, they're just not. They're not legitimate, and you've got some precincts in places like in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where the turnout was over 100%. Well, that's impossible. Yeah, that's 100%, including people that were dead and moved away. So it's just ripe for bad actors. And at this point, Trump hasn't gotten very far in the courts. And my view is, in the end, he probably won't. But there's over 1,000 sworn affidavits of people that and also now there's security cameras of basically the Republicans in Philadelphia and Detroit being told to leave. They forced out. They couldn't watch the polling. And in one case, they put paper over the window so they couldn't even look in and see. Well, all of that raises this specter, which I think at this point makes it For 3 years we heard from, about Trump. Oh my God, he colluded with the Russians. He's a Russian agent, on and on and on and on. Well, they spent $45 million and put Robert Mueller and some real rabid attack dog lawyers that went after everything they could. In the end, Robert Mueller said he couldn't find any U.S. person, let alone a Trump person, that had colluded with any Russian person. After 3 years. And they used that, to delegitimize him to the extent they could. Well, Biden's coming in even a worse situation. All the people that voted for Trump are going to say, you cheated. There's tens of thousands. And the problem is the vote was so close. It was like 11,000 in Georgia. It was 10,000 in Wisconsin. Pennsylvania, about 80,000. Michigan, I can't remember, 25 or 30,000.
Very close, a lot of them.
But these are very, very close numbers. And frankly, Georgia and Milwaukee could probably be overturned if they could figure out people that were dead, moved away. And in Georgia, felons can't vote, and they've already found a bunch of them that voted. So, you have chaos. I think at the end, Biden becomes president, but he goes in with a real cloud over his head. And the other cloud he had a few weeks before the election, his son's laptop contents, he'd left it stupidly. But this guy's basically a wild drug addict. I mean, he womanizes. He's not a good guy. Stupidly left his computer, and he never came back to get it, so it became the property because he didn't pay his bill and abandoned it. And the guy gave it to some people. It turns out he'd already given it to the FBI.
Yeah.
And why they didn't go through, I don't know. But anyway, there's a lot of damaging stuff in there, right? And the major newspapers not only didn't run it, and the major networks didn't run it, but Facebook and Twitter both wouldn't let anybody talk about it. New York Post broke the story. Twitter closed their account, so they couldn't talk about it on Twitter. So, that sounds okay. And they kept saying, well, we can't verify this, which, is a bit nonsense because they've let all sorts of wild, crazy things run on other people. Even stories that are attributed to anonymous sources, right? I mean, you're not going to verify that at all. So they basically chose a side, but drip, drip, drip. People kept coming out, vetting it, and that's nonsense, but these three are real. And then not long before the election, a guy sat down who comes across enormously credible. And if the Republicans hold the Senate, you're going to see him under oath. And what he said in that was, they set up this company, and they took over an asset management company. The Bidens and Hunter Biden and a couple of his buddies fired all the managers, took it over, and then they got an infusion of over $1 billion from Communist Party. The Chinese government basically gave them $1 billion for an investment fund. Well, they didn't know what they were doing, so they hired this guy who's got a stellar record. I mean, so far, as much as they might try, they haven't come up with any dirt on this guy. Military career, went to a military academy, I think, great education, good business experience. They hired him to run it. And he said, I met with Joe Biden when he was vice president in a hotel in Los Angeles, which they verified by looking at the Secret Service records. Right? Well, in his thing, he said, I sat there with Joe Biden, and we talked about the ownership. And Joe Biden owns, either in his own name or through somebody else, he said he owned 5%. So there you have now somebody about to become president of the United States who, what's 5% of $1 billion, man? I mean, it's a lot of money, and for far, far less than that, they went after Trump, they impeached him, and all sorts of things. I don't know if the hypocrisy is that deep and that thick, but whatever targets Trump, gave them to shoot at, Joe Biden has given them even as much or more. So. I think we're in for a tumultuous time.
I guess to end the United States talk is, I guess, where the country sort of, the thing that we're seeing right now is we're still getting. I didn't expect it to sort of be like this right now at the end of December 2020 that they would be getting record number of cases of coronavirus and deaths, and obviously in Australia and New Zealand we've been incredibly lucky. But obviously, it's been managed in a way that it's helped. It's going to be a bit of a tough couple of years, I think, for the United States. It's a tough few years. We'll see.
politically it's going to be chaotic.
Yeah,
but we have,
yeah.
The health and education are the prerogatives of the state governments.
Yeah.
So we've got 50 states with 50 governors and 50 plans on how to fight COVID and wide open borders. I mean, it's something we're going to be able to control. So I think if the vaccine gets out there, it'll start coming around. But frankly, in a lot of these areas, they've been essentially under lockdown since March. And a lot of the people have just had it. They're starting literally to ignore and defy the state governors. And for example, in California, Gavin Newsom just entered a very strict other lockdown order. And basically the sheriffs of Southern California, the county sheriffs, charged with law enforcement, just said, we're not doing this anymore. This is unconstitutional. You can't do this. So, you're starting to see a real breakdown. I'm not sure how that ends, but it isn't good, when law enforcement officers are telling people we're not going to enforce your edicts because they're unlawful. It's...
I've heard of a lot of people moving away from California because of Newsom.
Well, California's a mess. There's no other way to put it. It's just a big, big mess. I mean, very high taxes. The homeless situation.
Especially around the LA area.
Yeah, LA, San Francisco. LA spends over $200 million a year on homelessness, and they still have 25 or 30,000 people. And I mean, honest to God, if they set up a tent or living in a car in front of your house, you can't get rid of them.
Yeah.
And you'll see needles on the front sidewalk. I mean, you'll see people, urinating in your yard and all that kind of thing. It's just unbelievable. They won't deal with it. So there's a lot wrong. And a lot of people are. And there's a parameter people watch. Believe it or not, there's a company in the United States called U-Haul, and they rent trucks and trailers to people that move themselves, self-moving, right? Yeah. And give them the pads and the dollies and everything. The cost of renting a truck to move from California, say, to Texas is 5 times higher than it is to go from Texas to California. And the reason is all the trucks are stacking up in Texas. And they're probably almost to the point now where they give it to you free if you just get it back to California so they can rent it again.
Yeah.
It's that bad. New York's also facing this. New Jersey, people fleeing.
Okay. I mean, I think it's been a bit quieter on the New York front, but they obviously started off the start of COVID. They were hit the worst.
And it's building back up. And it was the governor of California was on the news every day, and he was complaining. And in short order, the United States Army built a 1,000-bed hospital in the Javits Convention Center. And the United States Navy has 2 hospital ships with 1,000 beds each. It's one of those interesting things about Donald Trump. He wanted to go to New York, and the admirals told him it was in for refitting and being resupplied, and it would take a month. He said, you've got one week to get that ship under sail. And by God, he said, if you don't, I'll get new admirals. And they did it. And it's one of those things. Trump, honest to God, he'll just drive you crazy with his tweets, and he'll come across as being such narcissistic. I'm doing this and I'm doing that. Yeah. But if you listen to him long enough, like in these COVID things, then he'll turn around and say, and here's my team, and this guy is wonderful, and come up here, Bob. And he praises these people. Yeah. Then he leaves the room and the professionals stay another 45 minutes and explain to you what's going on. Yeah. But his administration has gotten an enormous amount done, like him or not like him. Yeah. And I would tell your listeners, if you want to understand why people voted for Trump, go into YouTube and watch a video from Bill Maher, M-A-H-E-R. He's a comedian, has a show on YouTube, and he's pretty far left, and he hates Donald Trump, but he lays out quickly. There's some profanity in it, very quickly though, in a few minutes, exactly. Why people who personally don't like Trump would nevertheless vote for him. And
interesting. Okay. That's really some good insights.
But it's policy. I'll just wrap it up with a couple of quick examples. I mean, the Trump administration has reversed just tens of thousands of regulations, and we have a big government in the United States, and the job of these bureaucrats is to regulate, right? Under Obama, they were uber regulators, and to my point of view, they were throwing sand in the gears of commerce with both hands as fast as they could. And they're going to go back to doing that. They're going to reverse all that. Well, that's one reason the American economy began to boom, is he got that off their backs. But personally, this is one thing people don't understand. He got crosswise with our European allies very quickly. And every president in my lifetime has asked the Europeans to pay their treaty-obligated commitments, financial commitments to NATO, very politely. Obama, the Clinton, both Bushes, and they were politely ignored. Donald Trump asked them, they said no, and he began to threaten them and call them names. Well, guess what? He got the money. Yeah. And that's one of the things that people look at Trump. And I'll give you one more, and this is why the middle class and the lower middle class are so fond of him. He's the only president for a long, long time that has not got us involved in a war. I mean, both the Bushes got us involved in the Middle East, Clinton in Serbia, Obama in Libya, and then his fecklessness in Syria resulted in a disaster there. Donald Trump hasn't done that. We're almost out of Afghanistan. He's pulled us out of Somalia, and he's drastically reduced the troops in Iraq. Our military is a volunteer military, and the rank and file of that military comes basically from the lower middle class and the lower class because it's seen as an opportunity. Somebody can, have no means in life but go in the military, and in a few years they know how to fix diesels. I mean, they worked on tanks or whatever, right? So those are the people, and why those classes love him because he also, and then I'll quit after this. He early on got very crosswise with the people in the Pentagon and the generals, and he got rid of people like Rex Tillerson at State, replaced him with Pompeo, and got rid of Mattis and replaced him with somebody else, Mattis at Secretary of Defense. They took him over there and they gave him a slideshow and were trying to convince him that, you're pissing off our allies in Europe and that's not good, and, you're stepping on all these toes. And he asked one simple question. He said, what's your plan to win the war in Afghanistan? We've been there for 17 years. And they told him, well, we don't have a plan to win. It's a holding action. And he said, you mean we're going to spend billions of dollars a year and lose the lives of young Americans for holding action? And they said, that's right. And then he said, you're a bunch of whiners and losers, which you tell a general that ain't exactly the right thing. But when he went to Afghanistan one time, he only asked, they had meetings scheduled for him. He said, the only meeting I insist I have is I want to sit down with enlisted men with no officers in the room. I want to know what's happening from the people who are getting shot at. Yeah. And those are the kind of things that endear Trump to people, despite his horrible rhetoric and his horrible personality. Yeah. There's some foundation there. And with Joe Biden, a lot of this is going to reverse. Trump's made enormous progress in the Middle East, by the way. Yeah. In fact, today Morocco and Israel just normalized relations. That's about the fifth Arab country that's done it. That'll probably be reversed. U.S. will probably go back into the agreement with Iran. But what disturbs me most is I think our biggest problem in the United States is the really poor quality of schools in the inner city of the United States. Most of these inner city school districts are predominantly minority, 75%. Most of these cities and these districts have been controlled by Democrat and African American Democrat politicians for 30 years. And they need to do better. And one of the big problems is the teachers' unions. And I understand that's a problem here in New Zealand. The grievance procedures they've gotten is harder to fire a bad teacher than a bad policeman, and we have some problems with some bad cops. And everything's seniority. You don't get raises or promoted for merit or hard work or anything else. And they're against the out-of-the-box solutions. We call them charter schools, vouchers, and homeschooling. And Biden's going to go. He's talked about the president of the teachers union becoming Secretary of Education, and he said his department would be teacher-centric, not student-centric, teacher-centric. You got that? So, those are the kind of things that people feared and would vote for Trump, even though they couldn't, they hated his guts as a person. So that's, it's a lot more complicated than what you hear on the news. Yeah. And anyway, I could go on a long time. That's probably more than
we could certainly speak about how to fix America's problems, and we'd be here for another few weeks and not get too far. But, I do appreciate your obviously basically what you've sort of told our audience here today, that about everything to do in your bits and pieces, some stories out of your career. I guess why you like coming across to Queenstown and maybe possibly calling this place home for longer term. Yep. And obviously, I do know that obviously you're very passionate about the way things, working back from where you come from, and obviously where the political system is at the moment, and some really good insight that a lot of people in this area probably wouldn't know. So thank you very much, Jim, for all of that. Anything sort of final, anything final that you wanted to sort of finish on?
I would say, I love New Zealand. as a country, and I think the people here should be very, very thankful for not only are they an island nation, which can, lock out something like COVID, but, most of the people here are, by and large, they're European heritage. They're all on the same page, and even the other people that come here, fit in very easily. You don't have the tensions and the divisions. It used to be in America people didn't vote because it didn't matter if it was a Democrat or Republican. They weren't that different. And I look back at New Zealand, I think, there's differences between Labor and National here, but you all get along. You talk things out. You get things done. You don't dwell on the divisions. And the United States looks horrible, but honest to God, I've traveled in a lot of the world. The United States is better than most of it, and New Zealand's better than the United States in terms of, a place to live in harmony.
Mm. Yeah, thanks very much for your time here on a Friday afternoon, Jim. It's been a pleasure. We'll get this uploaded and be able to share it around to my audience, and you do the same if you'd like. It's up to you. Okay. Thank you very much, and have a great Christmas and New Year.
All right, thanks. Merry Christmas.